Earlier this week, the Restrict Act was introduced by 2 U.S. senators. The possible overreach that this act could enable is very frightening. Let's take a look at this. Welcome back, everyone. We are going to dive into a really nice little overview of the Restrict Act. This is an article that came out of Coin Center. So look, in the last couple of days, we've seen a lot of the documentation that has come out of the Restrict Act, and we've seen a lot of Bitcoiners cite different pieces of it. It's obviously, like all legislation, it's full of legalese. It's full of a bunch of nonsense language. So I'm going to go through it with this article because I think it sums it up nicely into some clean talking points where we could try to give it a much better comparison to what we have already. Here we go. The Restrict Act creates blanket authority with few checks to ban just about anything linked to a foreign adversary. Vague language is always really helpful when you want to just make sure that you can do whatever you want. The Restrict Act, introduced by Senators Warner and Thune, aims to block or disrupt transactions and financial holdings involving foreign adversaries that pose risk to national security. It's interesting because I'm pretty sure that KYC AML laws are already supposed to do this. And then there's also OFAC compliance, which is also nonsense. But anyways, we need more regulation. It's the problem is that we need more regulation. Anyways, okay, I will continue. Although the primary targets of this legislation are companies like TikTok, the language of the bill could potentially be used to block or disrupt cryptocurrency transactions and, in extreme cases, block Americans' access to open source tools or protocols like Bitcoin. The act creates a redundant regime paralleling OFAC without clear justification. It significantly limits the ability for injured parties to challenge actions raising due process concerns. And unlike OFAC, it lacks any carve-out for protected speech. It's interesting that the framing that's being done with OFAC, right? Because, all of a sudden, OFAC compliance isn't bad because take a look at this shitty act. Restrict was like, hold my beer. Like, OFAC, get out of the way. Okay, I'm sorry. It's serious stuff. Here we go. The Restrict Act is conceptually similar to the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, the law that empowers OFAC to block Americans for transacting with sanctioned foreign persons. Coin Center does not object to the use of OFAC's powers under IEEPA to block transactions with actual foreign adversaries, such as transactions to an Iranian individual holding private keys to a Bitcoin address, or to a custodial mixing service that launders North Korean ransomware payments. We are very concerned that an overbroad interpretation of those powers could be exploited in order to ban Americans from using entire classes of technologies, even when no foreign adversary has an actual proprietary interest in the technology as a whole. All things considered, we'd rather not have these broad and abuse-prone powers being wielded somewhat redundantly by either the Commerce Secretary or OFAC. And it's not clear why this additional legislation is needed when IEEPA already provides the administration with very broad authority to block transactions with foreigners that threaten our interests. Now, here's the juicy part, the differences between the IEEPA and the Restrict Act. There are some differences between IEEPA and the Restrict Act that could make fighting over broad interpretations more difficult if the act was to become law. The Restrict Act does not have a statutory carve-out for transactions dealing primarily in information and protected speech activities. Secondly, it empowers the Secretary of Commerce to make prohibitions without the need for the president to first declare a national emergency, as with the cyber executive order that preceded the Tornado Cash sanctions. And for the people that don't know, Tornado Cash was a shitcoin mixing service that got horribly wrecked like 6 to 8 months ago, I think. Anyways, we actually did a video on it. You know what? I will, it'll pop up as a card during this video for people who want to go back and take a look at that. Third, It limits judicial review to the DC Circuit, which raises real questions about fairness and access to justice for aggrieved Americans. Fourth, it exempts agency action pursuant to the Act from review under the most relevant sections of the Administrative Procedure Act. While the substance of the law is little different from IEEPA, the process for challenging abuses of power is worryingly circumscribed. If the Restrict Act was passed into law and misinterpreted to ban an entire open source cryptocurrency protocol, Americans would have trouble bringing a challenge. A broad and discretionary power to ban and disrupt all manner of information technologies should not be wielded without appropriate oversight and opportunity for review. The Restrict Act not only fails to ensure these rule of law protections, in many cases, it attempts to subvert them. While the primary purpose of the Act is to address national security concerns, its potential implications for the cryptocurrency space cannot be ignored. The differences between the Restrict Act and the IEEPA, coupled with the potential constitutional issues, warrant close scrutiny and a cautious approach to ensure that the legislation does not result in unintended consequences for the cryptocurrency ecosystem and Americans' access to innovative technologies. Okay, so obviously this sounds like a whole lot more of the "then they fight you." As some of the Act documents, some of these technologies that may get these types of restrictions, and up to $250,000 fine are technologies such as VPN technology. Now, look, I think that's going to be incredibly difficult to implement. In all honesty, I mean, in my past job, I used VPNs on a daily basis, so it's going to be very interesting because corporations use VPNs, and I mean, it's going to be a gray area. So there's going to be some people who are legally allowed to use VPNs while some aren't. That kind of sounds like a whole lot of the system that we have right now. Rules for thee and not for me, you know? So that seems like it might become that type of situation. Who knows? The other piece is this. The government's never been able to stop the Tor network. Okay, and before the Tor network, there was the GNU-Tela network, and I think they still exist. I just really don't see this as practical. I understand that there have been people who have been made to be examples when these types of laws come into play, right? Like, when, you know, for downloading movies and stuff like that. Definitely, there were people who were made examples of, but the reality is that that hasn't stopped, and I highly doubt that it has slowed down. So this idea that the government could somehow enforce this type of regulation on a mass scale, I don't buy it 100%. Now, the idea that they can ban technologies such as Bitcoin. I mean, look, China has an incredibly authoritarian, China is an incredibly authoritarian country. Okay, there's no secret there. They banned Bitcoin miners. There's Bitcoin miners there still. China still uses Bitcoin. I think that 11% of the hash rate comes out of China. So, you know, again, obviously, we don't really want to hear this type of rhetoric coming out of the government, because indeed it is anti-free speech. Indeed, we should not have these type of laws that cripple the use of technology. I believe that we should be embracing a free market, right? Like we should absolutely be embracing these technologies, figuring out how to use them for the betterment of everyone, because everything is a double-edged sword, right? You know, it's I know it's going to be a stupid example, but like something like a fork, right? Yeah, sure. You can use a fork to eat, you know, which can help you so that you have enough energy so that you can go and work. But then you could also stab somebody in the eye with a fork, right? It's a weapon. It's double-edged, right? It all depends on the wielder. And the problem is the government is an incredibly terrible wielder. And they have no incentive. They just have no incentive to actually do what's quote unquote the right thing, because their incentive is to maintain the government, because that's where they get their paycheck, and they get to feed their family that way. It is a world of incentives. So they are not necessarily incentivized to do the right thing. And the reality is that when you're in a position of power, you often do not get treated the same way by the laws that you yourself implement. Other people will be treated in a harsher manner quite often, and you will get to skirt by because, like I said before, it's rules for thee and not for me. I definitely, to wrap this up, I am worried by this type of legislation. Like, I'm not going to lie and, pretend like it's a whole nothing burger. It's not a nothing burger. But I do think, I do believe that there are enough of us, enough human beings that desire freedom and that desire and that appreciate and desire and understand the importance of free speech, that are going to take the other side of this argument and they're going to fight it. Anyways, we're gonna see what happens. This is definitely not a positive development, and not just for Bitcoin. It's also just not a positive development for America as a whole. I understand that the people that put through this legislation, introduced this legislation, I should say, believe maybe that what they're doing is best for their country. There's a saying: the imposition of order equals the escalation of chaos. And in my eyes, from what I've seen, the more laws we make, the more it proves that our system is broken. I believe that the numerous laws that we have are a symptom of a broken system. They're a symptom of a system that doesn't make sense. And as a result, every law conceivable has been created in order to keep us civil to each other. This is pathetic, okay? And this Restrict Act is anti-human, and it is also pathetic.